Hello, this is Peter from the Melbourne on Transit blog. Infrastructure Victoria recently released its 30-year infrastructure strategy. There's 45 recommendations intended to be achievable, or at least started, in 5 years. It's important to mention that Infrastructure Victoria is an advisory body that advises the state government on infrastructure matters. It provides advice only and is independent of other government departments. So just because it's in the Infrastructure Victoria report doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen. It's advice only. Having got that out of the way, let's have a look through the report and some of the recommendations, especially as regards transport. There's 45 recommendations, key recommendations, of which around 11 are transport related. As well as those 45, there's 8 future options. Now let's have a quick look through some of them. Recommendation number 6 is more accessible infrastructure. A lot of that is to do with transport. It mentions that the government has missed the deadline to get public transport accessible by 2022, and very pointedly refers to it taking 166 years to complete all tram stop accessibility upgrades. That's at the current rate of progress. So it's quite a pointed comment in there in relation to the transition towards a fully accessible public transport network. Bus stops, though, were a bit better in terms of progress. Around 50% of those were considered accessible. Another point, more in relation to land use, is rezoning locations near existing infrastructure. The idea being that more compact cities are more economical to operate, less infrastructure, and greater use of what infrastructure is already there. So basically having higher density housing and land uses near existing public transport especially. That was recommendation number 7. Related to that is number 8, which is largely about urban consolidation. Higher densities in established areas, particularly within 10 or 15 kilometres of the CBD, and that specifically was to do with extending trams to more homes. And so there were suggested tram network extensions, a couple to Arden, which is the new station on the Metro Tunnel, opening very soon. Fisherman's Bend, there are a couple of tram extensions there, a major brownfield site I've mentioned before in the blog, and then 4 tram extensions in the middle suburbs. There's a lot of cases where trams might just stop 1 or 2 kilometres short of the nearest station or large shopping centre. Some of these tram extensions help sort that out. The historical background back 70 or 80 or so years ago were that the tramways were competing with the railways. So the idea of trams feeding people into train stations was against the commercial interests of the tramways especially. So a lot of cases where tram routes finish just short of train stations. But if you want a connected network, then it makes sense that they at least extend to the nearest station. Anyway, specific recommendations there for the middle suburbs. Hughesdale tram extension that would also service Stradston Shopping Centre. An extension to Moorabbin, that would be the 64 tram going there. An extension to Burwood East that would assist in connecting with Deakin Uni and the proposed suburban rail loop station. Also in the north, an extension up to in the Coburg area as well to Batman Station. So basically established middle ring suburbs would get extra tram access and some improved network connectivity. So that's recommendation number 8. Also, later on, they suggested 2 longer tram extensions from about 2030 onwards. Airport West to Melbourne Airport, and also High Point to Sunshine. Recommendation number 9 was faster buses more often in the larger cities in the state. So Melbourne, Ballarat, Bendigo, Geelong, etc. And there was a point made that bus coverage was generally pretty good, but the usage was quite low. And when you look at bus patronage, bus usage across Melbourne, fewer people use buses compared with the numbers using either trams or trains, even though the train and tram networks only serve a minority of the residential population. Buses have much better coverage, but the usage of buses in terms of annual bus trips is much less. So there's definitely thinking here that you could be doing a lot more with our buses. And there is a target of 80% of the population within 800 metres, or about 10 minutes walk, of public transport every 20 minutes or better, presumably 7 days a week. But if that was achieved, that would be a big upgrade on now. Currently, a lot of bus routes are every 30, 40 or even 60 minutes. And there are cases where even if they're every 15, 20 minutes on weekdays, it drops off a lot on weekends. So having that sort of performance target for buses and coverage every 20 minutes within 800 metres of 80% of people in the main cities, so that included Melbourne and the larger regionals, that would be a big uplift in available public transport. Also, bus operating hours is flagged. It suggested that 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. is much better than currently, and that's true. A lot of bus routes finish much earlier than that. And I should also mention that some of the recent bus upgrades in Werribee actually do deliver that extended hours of service. So maybe the government's listening to that. The section on buses also mentions bus reform, the benefits of it, about $1.20 in benefits for every dollar spent. I suspect that that's an underestimate. There would be cases where you've got overlapping routes that you could consolidate very easily, very cheaply. I suspect you'd get a lot more benefits than just $1.20 per dollar. There are some successes cited when buses are reformed or upgraded in service. The Route 800 Chadstone to Dandenong, that was upgraded last year. That had a 200% increase in Saturday usage, 1,100 trips on Sunday that didn't previously exist. So 800 was cited as a success story with improving buses. And some other examples as well, like Fisherman's Bend around Box Hill, when those routes were upgraded. And there's also mention of bus network reform. Not only did buses need to run for more hours a day and be more frequent, but more direct routes and higher speeds. And another pointed reference is there is mention of the need for network reform. And it was suggested that because some work had already been done, that is public consultation for Melbourne's north and northeast. This was part of the bus network reviews that were promised under the bus plan. They were announced in 2022, there was public consultation, they were rejected in Cabinet later in 2023. Anyway, Infrastructure Victoria quite cheekily referred to the need to pick that up again, and since they've already done public consultation on that, start straightening out some of the routes in Melbourne's north and northeast as a pilot project. So that was recommendation number 9 on faster, more frequent, more direct buses. Number 10 goes even further. Infrastructure Victoria suggests 6 bus rapid transit corridors, buses in their own lanes, going a lot faster than what we're used to with buses. A lot of them are cross-suburban, a lot of them are middle to outer suburban, so that would really feed in with the rail network. They'd provide some cross-suburban links, so I think that that is a good recommendation, and it's suggested that they could be going by the early 2030s. There's also a mention of another one that would be even cheaper and quicker to do, which is Doncaster Road, basically Route 907 to Mitcham. It's got a pretty good service as is. It needs a bit more priority, a bit more off-peak frequency, and that could be the first and the cheapest of the bus rapid transit corridors. Recommendation number 11 talks about trains. More services and more stations, with particular reference to Melbourne's west. The big theme here is Melton electrification. That will allow the regional V-line trains out to Ballarat be separated so they can run express, and Melton electric trains can run more frequently and fill in more of the stations that they suggest. For instance, Mount Atkinson, one or two others, is suggested as a new station on an electrified Melton line. The other benefit of that is that could free up the existing V-line diesel fleet. They could use that to go to other lines. For instance, it suggests that Tarneet, instead of being every 20 minutes off peak, it could be every 10 minutes, and that could use those trains that are taken from Melton, because Melton would have electric trains instead. The V-line trains could then be cascaded down on some of the other lines where extra service was needed. And so, as well, mention of Paisley Station as well. It's not an outer suburb, it's more in Altona North, and there used to be a station there many years ago. But anyway, it's a great spot for a station, as there is development along Millers Road. It's quite a major spine. You've got the potential of a major bus route there, and that would allow connection between, say, the Werribee, Laverton area and Altona North. At the moment, there isn't an easy connection by public transport, so a station at Paisley would be a great interchange, especially if it connected with other intersecting bus services like Millers Road into Footscray, and it would help some urban consolidation and housing there. So a new station at Altona North is suggested. Recommendation 12, more trains, more stations, but again, but this time in Melbourne's north, another major growth area. A big theme here is upgrading the upfield line. It's duplicating it so it's no longer so constrained with regards to train frequencies. That would allow the upfield line to run, say, every 10 minutes all day, which would make it a much more useful line, and would also take some of the traffic off the parallel Route 19 tram, which is frequent but very slow. Because people in the inner north areas like Brunswick and Coburg, they've got a choice of either you can have it frequent and slow, which is the tram, or you can have it fast but infrequent, which is the train. So if they were to put on those extra train services by improving the capacity, maybe doing it in conjunction with the planned level crossing removals, then that would improve the upfield line and give it potential for later extensions into growth areas. And so there's mention of a new stations at Beveridge. That's a fast growing area in the outer north. Also Campbellfield, another potentially really useful infill station. There's a big shopping centre quite near there. There's a major bus route, 902, that runs along there. If you flipped that over with the 901 bus route, then that would give you a really good connection to Melbourne Airport. So yeah, a station at Campbellfield is also suggested in the Infrastructure Victoria strategy, which I think is really good. Number 13, more bus and coach services for regional Victoria. A couple of things there. There's some suggestion of improved services on orbital type routes like Geelong through Ballarat, Bendigo. There's suggestions for other routes that cover Shepparton and Echuca. That's the first part. Also, local bus routes in some of the major regional towns. Some areas have got, a reasonably comprehensive bus network. Some do not. Mildura was one of the areas that was included in the government's promised bus network review, but hasn't happened. So Mildura would be the sort of area that would get a revised town network. Wodonga, currently very complicated. The bus network hasn't been revised for years, so that would be another. It also mentions several other regional centres that needed some improved buses, and it suggested buses every 30 minutes for the larger centres and every 60 minutes for the smaller centres. The interesting thing, though, is if you look at some of the inner regional train lines, they run at 40-minute frequencies. Some of them have been upgraded from 60 to every 40 minutes, like, for instance, Ballarat, Gippsland, so how they would tally with the bus connections every 30 or 60. Not sure how that would go there. But anyway, that was recommendation 13, more bus and coach services in regional Victoria. Number 14, cheaper off-peak public transport fares. I suppose that's particularly an issue in Zone 1, where your trip just for a 2-hour ticket is relatively expensive. You can have a long regional trip for the same cost as going a few stops closer in. There's also mention of scrapping early bird, which is a monomodal fare, which only applies to metro trains for people getting the train early before 7 or 7:15 a.m. But there's a suggestion that instead of having early bird just applying on the trains, which puts pressure on parking spots at train stations, you could have off-peak fares that apply to all modes. So that is suggested in that recommendation for cheaper off-peak public transport fares. Also, for regional Victoria, they have a lot of fare zones, which it suggested that's a bit of an overkill, so they're suggesting making that a bit simpler. Now, there is reference to buses, because Infrastructure Victoria, in a previous report just on buses, suggested making buses a lot cheaper than train or tram trips. I've written in my blog about it. I don't think it's a good idea, and it would introduce a non-multi-mode feature of the fare system, so you had different fares for different modes. In my view, it's not a good idea, because it would also make planning and bus network reform much harder, because as well as potentially meaning if you've got a bus network reform that changes bus routes so that some trips, instead of just being one seat on a bus, if they involve a change to a train or a tram, then under the current fare system you can do that without any increase in fare. But if you have buses with a cheaper fare, then as well as potentially forcing people to change, if you reform a bus network, which Infrastructure Victoria say that they support bus reform, then you're also potentially making some trips more expensive, which makes bus reform politically even more difficult than it is now. So I think that's a bad idea. But anyway, they just suggest that as an option to consider later on. But the prime recommendation there is cheaper off-peak fares for public transport. 15, there's a couple of other recommendations in relation to active transport. 15, safe local streets, particularly children's schools, lower speed limits like 30 kilometres an hour in a lot of areas. Also a suggestion, recommendation number 16, of a coherent cycling network. One of the big issues with cycling, a lot of people would cycle, but they're just on the same roads as cars. Issues with accidents, safety. It's just too risky for a lot of people. In fact, that would be the majority of people who could cycle but just don't. And these are for a lot of your local trips. And cycling would be quicker than taking the bus. A lot of local trips are made by driving, which is contributing to congestion on the roads. But if people don't have safe options other than driving, then they're not going to do that. So providing for cycling infrastructure, I think, is really important as part of the mix there. Regarding roads, there's again emphasis on making the best use of existing assets rather than expanding and building a lot more roads, as that's seen as not a complete fix because of the traffic that can induce. So there's much more emphasis on extending modern traffic control technology to make the best use of what we've already got. And in freight, there's an emphasis on shifting to rail where possible, and also extending freight to be delivered off-peak rather than in peak, again to reduce pressure on the road network during the busiest times. There's also some future recommendations. These ones a little bit longer term, maybe not quite the next 5 years, but a bit after that. Or maybe they're things that are just politically controversial. For instance, road user charging is mentioned there. That could be to do with parking or congestion. Sustainable urban freight and urban delivery zones, that's in there. Another one, a bigger project in relation to rail, which would improve CBD rail capacity is reconfiguring the city loop. And there's mention there of benefits for Craigieburn, Upfield and Frankston. The idea of reconfiguring the city loop is that you split some of the train lines that go through the city loop and back out again. You split those so that you've got some trains may miss Flinders Street station. For instance, you might link up Frankston with Upfield and Craigieburn. However, the trade-off is that you've got increased capacity, which, depending on how the CBD grows in the future, that may be needed. So I think that so they put that in as one of the longer term things you can do, and that's covered in some of the other previous rail planning documents. Reconfigured city loop. That would create through lines rather than loop lines, which is also better geometrically. But the trade-off is that for getting to some stations like Flinders Street and Southern Cross, you may need to change trains if you're coming from lines that are proposed to be reconfigured, like Frankston, Upfield and Craigieburn. And I should also mention that there is actually scope for improved services on the Craigieburn line as is, even before reconfiguring. For instance, 10 minutes off peak, and I think that should be done sooner rather than later. There's also suggestions for extensions in the outer southeast. I didn't mention that before. I should have mentioned it. It's one of the future growth areas. For instance, Calcallo is mentioned up in the outer north. There would be electrification there. You could extend have the Upfield line going through Roxburgh Park and going further north. That would relieve the crowded Craigieburn line, so that is suggested. A Clyde electrification or extension in the southeast from Cranbourne, major development area, and it suggested also a new station at Dandenong South that would help some of the industrial jobs connections there, and also potentially an east-west bus route from Fountain Gate through Dandenong South through to Keysborough area. So that was suggested as one of the future things. I think that's really good. So overall, that's a quick summary of Victoria's 30-year infrastructure strategy. The government has to respond to it. I think they've got quite a long time. I think it might even be about a year, so it may be a fair time before we hear from the government on their thoughts on it. But it's got some really interesting points that I think would make a big difference. There's definitely an emphasis on better using our existing infrastructure. We're at a time where the government's had a big build agenda, they borrowed a lot of money, built a lot of projects, but especially for projects like rail, we're still not using our assets as heavily as we could be and still not getting the maximum benefit. Not just off-peak frequencies for rail, but also for buses, especially on weekends, and with trams, the infrastructure utilisation of those could be improved if you were to provide some higher speeds through better tram priority. A lot of the infrastructure recommendations would be making the best use of what we've got. And also changing people's choices in relation to travel. A few thoughts for me. I really liked the plan. I think they could have gone a bit further on developing a frequent network. I thought the 80% within 800 metres of 20 minutes was fantastic as a network planning objective. We do need to think about access to frequent service as much as the routes that people have. People might be a short walk to a bus stop, but if the service is infrequent or if it doesn't run very long hours, then it's not very useful. Having these sort of really strong minimum service standards and things like 20 minutes, 800 metres, 80% of the population is really, really good. I think they could have gone further in recommending a frequent network of turn up and go every 10 minutes. Obviously, less than 80% of the population might be near it, at least for now. But if you had a performance measure of something like 50% of the population within 10 minutes walk of service every 10 minutes or better, that could be sort of a dual standard, and that could be what could be really driving your modal shift, your land use and your development pattern. So you could have your high densities around that frequent network. And it would also be a highly marketable, connected network that would, I think, really boost public transport usage. So I really think they could have gone further on the frequent network. Also, rail reform. There was a lot of focus in the north and the west. I think there could have been a bit more of a scope given to rail network reform elsewhere. For instance, the peak stopping patterns on both the Geelong V-line service, there's a lot of them, that could be really simplified. Also, the Burnley group out to Ringwood, Belgrave, Lilydale. A lot of stopping patterns there. It's an area where there would be a lot of urban consolidation, and of course Box Hill is already very dense as it is. It's still got 30-minute gaps between trains at nights and Sunday mornings, relatively cheap to upgrade with existing infrastructure. So I think that that's an example of where there'd be the established area densification, changing land uses, and that would be reinforced by a rethink of the Burnley Group train timetable with much more frequent service, 7 days a week. So I think there could have been a greater mention of that. And I also refer you to the Rail Network Development Plan from 2012 that suggests those sort of upgrades as well. So that's it. Hope you found it interesting, and I'd recommend you have a look at the Victoria's Infrastructure Strategy, produced by Infrastructure Victoria for the next 30 years, and there's also some technical papers that go into details and some of the justifications for the suggested upgrades there. Thank you, and I'd love to read your comments. Please leave them below.